Okay, so welcome to this topic on gentrification, class and race, or why do cool places become so boring and lame so quick? So as usual, we're doing it in three parts. With the first part, we're going to discuss gentrification and creativity, and this relates back to some of the other parts of the course when we were looking at smart cities and creativity and that kind of stuff. So why talk about gentrification in a course on consumption and technology? Because really it is a process bound up heavily with those two things. As I'll talk about throughout the rest of the lecture, a lot of the forces of gentrification are around both production, that is people working in various places, often things not being made in an industrial area anymore. The industrial area becomes a place, kind of a ghost town, needs to be kind of reinvented. But also consumption. Consumption in the sense of often these places that are gentrified were quite either poor or had a kind of high level of kind of ethnic population in the as opposed to the kind of major population. And what that means is there's often a lot of actual creative things going on, art, punk, all kind of stuff kind of come out of these kind of places. The process we're talking about is heavily bound up in kind of technology and consumption in the way that these things produce. And I suppose, like the resulting things are that whenever money's involved, we end up pushing poor people out and richer people moving. So, broadly, gentrification is essentially the influx of privileged residents into what was usually a relatively poor or disadvantaged suburb. Often seen in the public sphere as being positive, like gentrification, the term isn't used, but things like development and stuff like that are used to kind of fix up previously kind of downtrodden areas or whatever. It seems to kind of happen organically in a way. Yeah. Development happens, people can afford to build new things. But really, it seems to be a little bit more pernicious than that in terms of the sociological analysis of this stuff. And I'll go through the process of how it happens in a sec. As I said, often industrial areas or rundown areas, production's moved elsewhere, these places are ripe for gentrification. And often places that like a kind of alternative that people would kind of seek out to go to clubs or bars or to see bands or to go to kind of underground artistic things. Things are often happening in these places before they're gentrified. Privileged white people like that stuff, they want to move close to it and they end up killing it when that happens. What's interesting about this too is there's a lot of racialised and class discourses around this. We need to make this area safe. And what that means is safe normally for middle-class white people. So, this kind of thing in terms of the inequalities and processes of space and where people live, gentrification is kind of the reverse in a way of what was called redlining in the US. And this was a process of exclusion based on various policy tactics and informational practices. I won't kind of go into this in too much detail, but, the geography of cities, the ways that they've kind of split up into suburbs and the way that then those suburbs get status and all these things around them has a long history, and it's always uneven. Often enforced in uneven ways by bureaucrats and governments. So I'll leave that kind of slide there if you're interested in that topic. What's interesting about the idea of redlining, and we've kind of touched on this in terms of AI as well, is it's also now happening through algorithms. So this is again this kind of digital layer of going over what we're talking about here. Where redlining was about real estate in the past, it's now as much about who can get insurance and that kind of thing.
Well, what's interesting too in a place like Australia with a lot of in-migration of different classes is that exclusion that was once based on race is now often got these strange twists to it, where a lot of sort of affluent overseas buyers who might not be white, particularly sort of from Asia, are attracted to areas that have been gentrified rapidly and to high property markets and high property values as a way to put money earned elsewhere, as a way to have investments, etc., especially since 2007 when those real estate rules have been relaxed. And they're often displacing other members of their own ethnic communities who can no longer afford to live in those areas, etc. Which is also a really fascinating kind of internal gentrification dynamic among minority communities.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, gentrification creativity. Now, like when I'm talking about here, I'm talking about places this has happened to already, like Williamsburg in Brooklyn in New York and Shoreditch and around East London and even places like Fitzroy in Melbourne and Newtown and Marrickville in Sydney. I suppose in a way, like even in inner suburbs of Newcastle, it's happened too as well. I mean, the eastern suburbs of Newcastle, around the beach there, around Zara Street and stuff like that, it's where prostitutes used to be in Newcastle in the 80s. It's obviously been cleaned up, and the real estate there now is like out of control. So it's a fairly common practice event that happens around the world. As we saw previously, we talked about creativity as something that's desired by governments, and they kind of use it as a thing to promote various activities, and councils want to have creative stuff going on. But remember too, when it comes to creativity, you look at your university now, things like creative industries and social science and humanities degrees are made more and more expensive, they're made more exclusive. So there's an interesting juxtaposition here. Creativity really doesn't mean anything critical, it doesn't really mean anything artistic.
Yeah. It just means flexible workforce in lots of ways,
be flexible.
Creativity is supposed to save the economy, yet there's no investment in it, in education and in training, etc., in universities, and it's supposed to sort of save the workforce, save cities, save environments, increase property prices, yet the two things are not necessarily
that's right. Creativity's become one of those neoliberal buzzwords like innovation, like flexibility, like agility, these things. So so creativity tends to align with things like, frictionless consumer experiences, making things safe. Certainly a whole bunch of greenwashing goes on where, pretend to make things more sustainable. They're generally not. Now this comes really from the work of Richard Florida. This book, The Rise of Creative Class, has been massively influential on policymakers and people like that. And in some ways you can understand why. The idea was that if you want professionals and creatives to kind of live in an area, it makes the neighbourhood's kind of stock rise, it makes the real estate rise. What you've got to do is provide, leisure activities for them. Flourishing suburbs need these things like cafes, art galleries and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of like a build hipsterish stuff and they will come. All tasteful, all safe, all this kind of thing. Takes the edge off kind of things that were maybe there previously that were kind of maybe, subversive or resistive. Florida also, in what seems, fairly tolerant kind of point of view, had this thing called the gay index, where if there was more gay men in an area, it means there's people there with the right careers, with the right tastes, the right kind of levels of tolerance, and this therefore would attract more people like them. Again, what's being attracted here generally is white, professional, middle-class people. So what happens here? What happens here in terms of the process? And Zukin's reading, which is one of the set readings for this topic, is really good at spelling this out. Sharon Zukin is an extremely important figure when it comes to thinking about gentrification and urban sociology and urban geography. So, alternate consumption practices, they lead to this kind of entrepreneurial kind of idea. Restaurants and bars pop up, all of a sudden there's things like farmers markets and stuff like that because middle class people like to, consume ethically as much as they can, certainly if it's easy. And this allows kind of those people then to perform this kind of difference, this form of distinction in a way from the mainstream who are wasteful and vulgar.
And go to malls. And that's that big thing we've talked about in other topics too, is that you get in your car, you go to a mall, you buy stuff that's come on a ship and is in a plastic bag. I walk down the street and I buy stuff from a gentleman with a moustache and a cool hat, and it's a very important part of their identity.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Now, I'll tell you a few things about that. We're sounding a little bit cynical. Certainly.
That is probably better, right?
No, farmers markets are good, right? They're good things, right? So in many respects, but they, particularly in urban centres, the way this stuff works, have detrimental effects often in terms of displacing the people there. So there's kind of this fabrication of authenticity in a way. It's not particularly as the original inhabitants have moved on. But what often happens here is the kind of area where that's happening starts gathering some kind of media attention. And this definitely happened in places like Shoreditch and Williamsburg. Hip things are happening here. But really now, if like Williamsburg, for instance, where a lot of the kind of rock scene of the early 2000s bands like the Yeah Yeahs and around the Strokes, they were in Manhattan, whatever. But there's these scenes that kind of build. Once that kind of happens, the prices go up so much that no one can afford to live anymore. That's like an artist, and they all have to move out. And now kind of trust fund kind of kids move in. So, once the media attention's at the place, it's kind of over for it. And then it kind of moves on to somewhere else. But what then happens is that the real estate prices go up, rents go up, and all of a sudden the original inhabitants tend to move out and new people come to the area and the whole place changes. So, Zukin has a lot of really interesting things to say about that, and she talks about how the middle class consumers, are not really kind of innocent of what's going on here. They often know what's going on and are the agents of change, which I think is a really important understanding of the responsibility of what's happening here. It's not just greedy real estate developers and real estate agents that are kind of doing this stuff. It's the people themselves.
And I think it's also interesting when we talked about scenes and scenescapes and how a scene develops, and that's almost like once it gets recognised outside that particular scene, that's almost the death knell for the area or the neighbourhood. You know that what's coming next will be a series of changes.
Yeah, and it happens with subcultures too, right? Yeah. Like, once the subculture becomes kind of reported and it often kind of kills it off and becomes co-opted.
Yeah, and so crucial how important consumption is to all of this, both as a practice that brings a lot of the change in, but then of maintaining that change and what kind of places are there to buy from and
That's
sell
right,
to,
yeah.
etc.
And what happens too in terms of the technology stuff too is all of a sudden you have a bunch of smart city stuff going on in this kind of thing. They're in the streets and there's fancy light bulbs that sing songs and all this kind of stuff going on.
And of course murals in front of which you can take selfies, tag with the place, circulate around the world, create desire to visit, you brand place in that way.
And to be clear here, I'm feel implicated in this as well. So when I travel, I want to stay in the hipster suburb.
Yes.
Right? Because
you don't want to stay in the big hotel by the airport.
No, that's right. So you're this kind of taste stuff is important to consider, and I think something I reproduce myself as well.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the kind of gentrification idea and the kind of push for creativity, you can kind of see that there's been a sense that we're somewhat cynical of it, but also there's been a kind of vast array of literature that criticises this point of view. Jamie Peck in kind of human geography is a key critic of Florida, and has really shown how the gentrification process is really detrimental to some people and advantages some over others. Particularly the way that class, race and gender are kind of completely downplayed in this idea of kind of who benefits. Creativity itself becomes part of this almost self-help kind of entrepreneurial discourse that has nothing to do with art.
Just get more creative.
Yeah.
Just get more entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
How are we training our students to be more creative and more entrepreneurial? Because that's what's going to get you a foothold in place and in a city and a town and a gentrifying area, which is, of course, heavily critiqued by people who actually studied this.
That's right.
And challenging that actually is.
And really, becoming more entrepreneurial and flexible seems to be code for becoming more more exploited.
Yes.
More willing to allow yourself to be exploited.
And willing to accept short-term, poor-quality work that gives you a sense of place and identity, but doesn't do much to give you some stability. Yeah,
and leaves you quite precarious in many ways. So the other important thing that they were pointing out here is what often then happens in this, and in some respects this is good in terms of environmental stuff, that people can seem to maybe moving around less, but gentrification then seems to be opening up where people can kind of work and play 24 hours 7, but really the emphasis here being on work.
Yes.
And I'll talk about that in the next section when it comes to the aesthetics of work as well. So you can live and play at the same place, at any hour. So this starts to blur the lines between work and leisure, labour and pleasure. So creativity discourses valorise aspects of artistry towards individualised, productive and market-driven ideals. Essentially, they take away the artistry and the kind of the aura and the passion of things and turn it into products. There's some prominent work on this more theoretically. McRobbie's work about the dispositive of creativity, and Boltanski and Capello talk about how the artistic critique of capitalism has been folded back into its very logic. They're really important works to think about the critique of creativity.
And to add too that social media is such an important place for a lot of the things that get made to be marketed and sold. So without that kind of technology innovation, the ability to design your own clothing, get them manufactured, and make people know about it is really dependent upon these massive social media networks and the large companies that run them. And so that critique of capitalism, even when you want to make individual, independent, bespoke things, you depend upon this media machinery to find customers, you depend upon electronic payment systems to get money, etc., etc., etc. So you become re-entangled in the system that you sort of wanted to create a distinction from.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the website where all the craft material is on. There's those ones the craft economy in particular has been definitely entangled back into these kind of processes. There's some really good work in Australia by Susan Luckman around that. So, to conclude, I just kind of also point to an ethnographic study, a really influential one done by Lloyd, who talks about how these kind of culturally hip and bohemian areas then rely on young people a lot for them to be culturally hip and be cool. And I'll talk about this in the third part of the lecture today in some research that we've been doing in Australia. But essentially young workers are required because they have the right look and feel and they're, sexy, edgy and cool and all that kind of stuff. They bring a presence and a vibe to a place that helps the reputation of, bringing more people in there to help cultivate the image of the venues. So I'll go into aspects of that in more detail in the last section. Okay, I'll leave it there.